Hello, and welcome to the webinar, The Empathy Tightrope, Balancing Trauma-Informed Responses and Prosecutor Resilience. Today's program is presented by Equitas and by Attorney Advisor Miko Anderson. My name is C. Ross. I am an Administrative Associate at Equitas, and I will be moderating today's webinar. If you have a question during the presentation, please enter it in the question and answer box. We will answer questions periodically throughout the webinar. You are also welcome to contact us directly at any time following today's presentation, and we will send you contact information during our follow-up. Next slide. Equitas's mission is to improve the quality of justice in sexual violence, intimate partner violence, stalking, and human trafficking cases by developing, evaluating, and refining prosecution practices that increase victim safety and offender accountability. Next slide. As a national training and technical assistance provider, Equitas develops resources, conducts trainings, and offers 24/7 consultations for prosecutors and allied professionals. For more information on Equitas, please visit our website at equitasresource.org. Next slide. You can follow Equitas on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. The link to each is available on our website. Next slide. You can also find information about our projects and special initiatives on our website. Next slide. Equitas is proud to have support from the Department of Justice Office for Victims of Crime to deliver cutting-edge national trainings to strengthen the Enhanced Collaborative Model (ECM) Task Force Model approach and build the capacity of existing and future human trafficking task forces by leveraging subject matter experts to address emerging issues, build skills relevant to investigating and prosecuting sex and labor trafficking, and ensure the implementation of best practices that are survivor-centered and trauma-informed. Next slide. Today's webinar is supported by the U.S. Department of Justice Office for Victims of Crime. The information presented in this webinar does not necessarily reflect the views of the Office for Victims of Crime. Next slide. This presentation includes the creative work of others. This property is being used by permission or under claim of fair use. Further use or distribution is prohibited. Next slide.
Hi, everyone. My name is Miko Anderson, and I will be the host for this webinar. And just to give you a little bit of background information on who I am an attorney advisor at Equitas, so I get the opportunity to do these trainings. And I am a prior, at least former prosecutor from California, where I prosecuted human trafficking, sexual violence, domestic violence, and gang violence cases. The objective of today's webinar, Empathy Tightrope, is to help you proactively address the secondary trauma and give you ways to have effective responses to victims of human trafficking, help you lead trauma-informed approaches when it comes to investigating and prosecuting both sex and labor trafficking, and also help collaborate to prioritize wellness and minimize burnout amongst you and your multidisciplinary partners. So human trafficking is a case, nature of this crime. If you've worked it, you know it can be very intense because the crime itself is the heinous act of exploitation and abuse. Those effects, because they are intensified based on the fact that the victimization can be very intense and trauma-inducing, and it can also include continuous abuse. And a lot of times it's common for the victims of human trafficking to be victims of prior abuse. So there's a lot of poly-victimization that comes with these cases. And when that happens, the effect of the trauma can be profound and multifaceted. So when we work with victims and survivors of human trafficking, we can see the trauma take many different forms in that work, and it affects both the direct and the indirect victim. So what is trauma? And this definition is one of a few, but it just says that trauma results from an event or a series of events that's more than mere stress. It's an event that the individual experiences either physical, emotional, psychological harm, and it has lasting adverse effects. And it affects the individual's functioning and physical and emotional, spiritual well-being. Stress versus trauma. And this is really one of the key differences, that with traumatic events, the effects are more extreme than they are for stressful events. A stressful event, that stress will be alleviated when the stressor is removed. However, with traumatic events, the impact of the trauma lasts well after the events have passed, and they have effects on the memory. So those events linger in the memory and in the body, and it takes a longer time to recover when it's trauma. And those effects of trauma, the ones that I were talking about, can take many forms and many different shapes and appear very different depending on the individual. But some of those types of effects could be the acute effect, when something has happened and the immediate reaction is intense, that acute effect, but it can be physical, psychological, sexual, emotional, spiritual, historical, generational, and environmental. One of the things that I like to remind the professionals who work with victims and survivors of trauma, a lot of times when trauma expresses itself in a different form, one that we may not have expected, we have to remember that a lot of that depends on the person's history, right? The victim or survivors, on their particular history. So when it comes to things like historical trauma, it's really important to not necessarily personalize that response if that's somehow related to some difficulty with that person engaging with whatever system that might be at play, and realize that it's really very unique to the particular individual. Previous trauma or poly victimization. Trauma survivors have been generally victimized multiple times. In the one instance of human trafficking that you may be exploring in a case, or with a particular survivor, or previously, many experience both physical and sexual abuse as adult and as children. Survivors have experienced more than one form of abuse as an adult. So again, it adds on the additional layers of complexity, and it can explain some of the reactions based on understanding the nature of the trauma that they may have experienced. And it's estimated that 68% of women who have been physically assaulted by an intimate partner have also been sexually assaulted as well. So that just illustrates the complicated nature of violence, trauma, and assault. How have you connected with victims of trauma? And that's a really important question, and something that we know is critical in serving those victims of trauma. And there are many ways that we connect. Sometimes it's through listening, and making sure that we understand and communicate to that survivor that they are being heard. It could be on how we set up interviews and different details, who's present, the location of the interview, if there is even in fact an interview, just different ways to connect to make sure that we put that survivor and victim in the best position to share information. Sometimes those connections are in person, sometimes they're over the phone, and sometimes it can require that we, as the receiving person, the professional, see, hear, and experience a lot of the details that are given that may be graphic or difficult to hear. So those connections, professional connections to trauma, and then also the connections to the victim. The emphasis that I'd like to make is that those are two different things. Connecting to the trauma is really understanding those events or series of events and how that happened, and maybe trying to get an understanding of what that impact is on that particular victim. Connecting, though, to the victim is separate because the victim is more than just the trauma. So being able to connect to what the concerns are of that victim as a whole person is a different process. They both are necessary, but they are two different processes. Primary and secondary trauma. Primary trauma, and I think most all understand that that's the trauma that generally happens to the person who was directly affected by the trauma, the one who was, for lack of a better word, the target of the trauma. And the secondary trauma, or sometimes vicarious trauma, is reserved for those who witnessed or somehow were affected by the trauma of another person, of that direct person. There was a study conducted that showed that working with victims and survivors of trauma was a professional duty to have that connection, but it also posed an occupational hazard, which meant that in this study, they showed that those who worked in the criminal justice system, and it was a variety of different professions, but in the criminal justice system, because they were able to listen to, hear, receive a lot of information that was traumatic, it was necessary as part of their part of their professional duties, but it also was an occupational hazard, right? It posed a risk to the professional for being so submersed in the trauma of another person. So how that trauma transfers, this again is some of the ways that we use to connect to victims and survivors of trauma, but it also can transfer some of the effects of trauma to the receiving party. So a lot of times it requires connecting with survivors, and that's how trauma can transfer. 911 calls, hearing the immediacy of an event as it is unfolding. Jail calls, a lot of times you bear witness to the dynamic, manipulation, abuse, power, the struggle that is happening between the parties. Recreating the crime scene means recreating a very traumatic event, right? A lot of times for prosecutors, that's what we aim to do, is recreate a crime scene. But in actuality, we are recreating trauma. So we are experiencing that as part of our professional duty. But then again, it leads to that occupational hazard because we have to be somewhat submersed in that in order to be effective. Going on scene, photos of injuries, videos of injuries, and CSAM material is also another way that trauma can just be transferred from that event to the professional that's receiving the information. So with that, how are professionals impacted? To have cases that require some of those transfer of trauma practices and some of that evidence, whether it's graphic videos or pictures or audio, whatever that is, how does that ultimately affect the professional? Because with the professional, it's not just a one event type of reviewing that information. It can be your entire caseload. So that there has to be some impact when you're receiving information of that nature on that scale. How has work impacted your life is another way to look at it. And I think that this slide kind of illustrates that a lot of times, because of the nature of what we do, that more attention is spent on quote unquote fixing others. And I know that's not a correct term, as opposed to taking care of ourselves. And especially with a crime as heinous as human trafficking, and seeing the traumatic impact firsthand, it just lends anyone to put more effort into trying to assist the survivor. But sometimes that can mean neglecting the things that we need as professionals to be able to do our jobs effectively. So the impact on professionals, there are probably more that could be shown than what's on this slide, but I'll just list these. Secondary trauma or vicarious trauma, burnout, compassion stress, where you no longer feel that compassion or compassion fatigue, and secondary traumatic stress are all different forms of impacts that it had that secondary trauma or receiving this information can have on the actual professional doing the work. Burnout. Now, pick this one out in particular because it is so common and it results from the exposure to a lot of secondary trauma if there's not an effective way to deal with it. And it occurs when the professional is tired, overwhelmed, becomes distant from the job, and every task seems like a huge chore, right? And it can go hand in hand with vicarious trauma, and they can both occur at the same time. And here's another illustration that kind of brings home the point. So we have stressed out Eric, who's present but stressed out. But then we have burnt out Eric, who was just too tired to even come and pose for the cartoon, right? You are completely disconnected and detached. And while you might physically be present, you may no longer be present with all the faculties and everything that you have to really be effective in a case. So the impact of secondary trauma, the cognitive impact is there, physical, emotional, behavioral, and the key takeaway is that it affects the person. So there is personal impact, whether it be emotional, spiritual, or any of these different categories. It's that the impact really affects the person. And cognitive impact. So the way that shows up can be a minimization of vicarious trauma, thinking that you're not feeling what you're feeling or denying it, low self-esteem, increased doubt, trouble concentrating, confusion, racing thoughts, and probably many more than what's included here on this slide, but lack of meaning when it comes to life, thinking that things are pointless, and then thoughts of harming yourself or others. So some very serious impact. And then the connection that I want to make is, how might this impact a human trafficking survivor if they're deciding, I'm sorry, human trafficking prosecutor, if they're deciding whether or not to file charges or go to trial or how to proceed in a case, right? Someone who is suffering from the cognitive effects of secondary trauma, if it's trouble concentrating or lower self-esteem or perfectionism, that will have a direct effect on how that case is being handled and how we are serving survivors. So it really goes hand in hand. To be able to effectively serve survivors, we have to make sure that we are able to really minimize and understand the impacts of secondary trauma. Behavioral impact. Behavioral impact. So vicarious trauma has an impact on our behavior. And there are probably more instances that can be listed here, but these are some of the most common. Sleep disturbances and patterns, nightmares, changes in appetite, losing things, being startled, jumpiness, are things to be aware of, can be related to secondary trauma. Self-harm behaviors and negative coping skills. So smoking, drinking, or acting out, or anything that is a negative coping skill can be related to that secondary trauma that is part of our professional, the risks that we take professionally. Interpersonal and social impact. Again, the same thing, just to have these in the forefront of your mind to recognize that it might have a connection to secondary trauma. And that's the withdrawal, loneliness, irritability, distrust, And that affects the personal relationships that we have, decreased interest in intimacy, and change in parenting style. So becoming overprotective. Some of those things can be directly related to secondary trauma. Emotional impact, the same thing, feeling helpless and powerless, especially in the face of really large caseloads where it seems that you may be spending a lot of effort and maybe not seeing a lot of result. Being oversensitive, emotional unpredictability, anxiety, are all things that you need to be aware of that may have a connection to the presence of secondary trauma. And then physical impact, and that's panic symptoms and sweating, difficulty breathing, things that we kind of can recognize physically in our bodies that might show that you are being impacted by secondary trauma. So with professional impact, it can show up in your job performance, the ability to, effectively perform certain tasks, morale, individual professionals' morale, and then how that can be contagious and spread throughout units and departments, in interpersonal relationships, because those interpersonal relationships are also professional. So it can have an impact on that. And then professional behaviors that you might have at work can be impacted by whether or not you are suffering from some of the negative impacts of secondary trauma. So how might this impact a human trafficking prosecutor's ability to respond in a way that is trauma informed, right? So the list of all those different forms and categories of the impacts of secondary trauma, right? The physical, the cognitive, the behavioral, the professional. How might that impact a human trafficking prosecutor's ability to really be trauma informed? And we know with being trauma informed, it really requires that you are present. So you can really assess and figure out what you need to do to serve the victim or survivor that you are working with. And so these are some of those examples of being trauma informed. So to ask about about emotional or sensory information, psychological memories, to be consistent and non-judgmental. That requires a different level of mental energy, right? To really be dialed in a way that is supportive emotionally and psychologically and non-judgmentally, to respond with empathy, right? That requires a higher level of connection. And it is very difficult to have that higher level of connection if privately you are suffering with the effects of secondary trauma in some of the ways that we described before. Right. And in trauma-informed prosecution, there's so many different ways that you need to show that you are trauma-informed, right? You need to inform. So whether it's with the interviews or collaborating with partners, training and debriefing, each of those opportunities to be trauma-informed will require that higher level of connection, mental connection and emotional connection and stability. So it makes it very necessary that in order to be effective there, you must really figure out a way to minimize and support your own self-care when it comes to the secondary trauma. So what influences the severity of exposure? Because not everyone suffers from secondary trauma, at least in the same way, right? It's present for prosecutors who are doing this work and really all allied professionals who are doing this work. It's something that's present just based on the nature of the work. But the severity of the exposure is influenced by different factors. There was a study of 47 participants, and it included professionals from multiple disciplines. So it included professionals from fire, medical services, law enforcement, victim service agencies, up to 15 different agencies participated in the interview and focus groups. And what they found was that empathetic engagement influenced the severity of vicarious trauma exposure. And we understand doing this work that empathetic engagement is critical, it's crucial, and that it was more common in victim service providers due to the cumulative exposure, right? And so beyond victim service providers, the same cumulative exposure is present with prosecutors and law enforcement officers who have these as part of their caseloads, because each of these cases are requiring that high empathetic connection, right? That same high connection in order to provide those trauma-informed practices. So what do you do when empathy is crucial? Right? Empathy, as we just learned from that study and probably from personal experience, know that empathy will increase the risk or exposure of secondary trauma, but it's crucial to providing support and trauma-informed services for victims of human trafficking. Empathy can be considered the trauma professional's asset and liability, right? It's necessary as an asset to effectively serve, but it also is a liability because it increases that risk of the professional being affected by secondary trauma. So when we look at empathy, there are different forms. Cognitive and emotional empathy are the two highlighted here. And with cognitive empathy, the focus is on understanding. The empathetic connection is seeing through the person and being able to critically think from this experience. There is still some separation. Emotional empathy is different. That emotional empathy, you feel the emotion of the survivor. And anyone who has sat in and had conversations with someone who has experienced the level of trauma, right? It is easy to understand how that can happen, how you can feel the emotion of the survivor as they are, sharing some very difficult experiences and traumatic experiences that they have survived. That, though, will risk re-traumatization, right? If you are so overwhelmed by the emotion, you can re-traumatize the survivor that you're working with. And it also increases that risk of secondary trauma, that emotional connection. And it's intertwined with personal trauma histories. And this is something that's not really discussed a lot, but a lot of times professionals who are in this, who do this work, are in it because they have some connection to personal trauma or some prior experience and want to do the work so they can be of help. But being in this circumstance where you are feeling the emotion of the survivor and may also have personal trauma history can increase that risk again of secondary trauma. So those factors, right, that we listed, and then other factors would include your personal life, because prosecutors, law enforcement, victim service professionals are whole people and have personal lives. So depending on the nature of what may be going on in your personal life, as well as, the trauma that is present in the case or exchange or connection that you're dealing with, that can be a factor on whether or not you suffer from the secondary trauma. And again, the personal trauma histories. If something strikes a chord or is some personal trauma history that is closely related to that particular experience that a survivor has gone through, can be a factor in how severe that secondary trauma exposure and risk is. So with all that said, what can you do? Because there's no way to eliminate the risk of secondary trauma. But there are ways to minimize it and are ways to try to do what you can to get in front of it so that you're not suffering from the effects of it. So in doing that, you can monitor yourself. So that list, that laundry list, I think there were 3 or 4 of them, of all the different ways that this secondary trauma can manifest itself in a person, in a professional, like lack of sleep and anxiety and all that, to be able to monitor yourself so you can understand where you are and gauge what services or support you might need. Take care of yourself. So do things that you know help benefit your well-being. So whatever those routines are, take time for yourself. Be honest with yourself. One of the things that I often note is that those who are in this profession sometimes have a difficulty being honest with themselves regarding where they are and the fact that they need help or support, because they are generally viewed as the help or support, but sometimes the helper needs help as well. So self-care assessment. So we'll list a few, but they are really very individualized to each person. But it should include some assessment that addresses your physical self-care, psychological, emotional, spiritual, and workplace and professional self-care. Physical self-care assessments can be as simple as just maintaining, a running log, or keeping an eye out on, are you eating regularly, exercising, taking many vacations can help your physical self-care. Are you doing the things that help you physically? So is it getting massages, running, physical activity, whatever that is, but making sure that that is a priority of yours when you are considering a wellness plan, and noting the type of activity that helps you with physical self-care. And it's the same thing with all the other forms. So with psychological self-care, is it self-reflection, journaling, learning something new, decreasing your stress in life? So really taking account and an assessment of where you are in your life, and that sometimes includes your personal life, and decreasing some of the stressors that you may have there, some of the things that you may have control over. Saying no to extra responsibilities, to not always feel obligated to do everything that is asked of you. Saying no and setting some boundaries can help with psychological self-care. And these are just, like I said, a few suggestions, and it really, this list and all these lists are driven by what's important to the particular individual, but these are great places to start. Emotional self-care, get professional support. Sometimes that can be difficult. One of the things, though, that I have noticed is that even at times when things are going well, if there is the opportunity for you to have professional support already established, so in the event that there is an issue or a crisis or a need to speak to someone, you already have that relationship there. Identify places that you can go and people that you can connect to that are emotionally supportive, right? Do things that make you laugh, so that this profession, which can often bleed over into our personal lives, that this profession doesn't take over more space than you want to allow. So allow yourself to have things that make you feel good. So whether it's like things that make you laugh, books, movies, writing, whatever that may be. Spiritual self-care. So however that looks like for you. So whether it's connecting to a particular community, being open to inspiration and just being curious about other things, meditating, prayer, singing, however that looks to you, and identifying what is meaningful to you is what's important. And then professional self-care. And this is one that requires the support of offices and office leaders, administrative leaders, to help develop policies on the review of graphic materials. A lot of times, and I remember as a prosecutor, I was guilty of it myself, I could have like very disturbing, dark jail calls playing in the background while I was doing something else. So never disconnecting, really, not having any boundaries when it came to how I received that information. Being aware of your trauma history and knowing that that can have an effect on how you are impacted by secondary trauma. And so knowing how that affects your risk, taking the time to debrief with your support team as a matter of routine and not just as it, happens. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't, but making sure, because you are aware that this is something that could alleviate some secondary trauma, that this is a routine that you can practice. Making quiet time to complete certain tasks. So a lot of times when there is a very difficult task, and I remember having conversations with a mother who lost their child, making sure for me to bookend those conversations with something that was that would allow me to de-stress. So whether in the front end, if it was a walk before I had the conversation, or if it was a walk after I had the conversation, if it was a debrief or a group session with some of my colleagues, but making a point to intentionally figure out a way to lessen the stress of very difficult, stressful events. So the takeaways that are key would be the importance of identifying how the personal and professional factors contribute to the risk of secondary trauma. A lot of times it's talked about only in the sense of the things that we experience professionally, which based on human trafficking and the severe amount of trauma and violence that those victims and survivors receive alone is a huge contributor, but also remembering to couple that with personal factors. What's going on in your personal life, your personal trauma history, and using that to make a full assessment on what your wellness plan needs to look like and what you need to do for self-care. Recognizing that responding to human trafficking victims in a trauma-informed way depends on applying secondary trauma-informed practices, right? Because, and just like I said, those high empathetic connections that we talked about are almost impossible to do if you are suffering from those negative impacts of negative impacts of secondary trauma. Those necessary empathetic connections require that you spend some time understanding secondary trauma and really developing a plan to minimize it so you can be effective. And developing that wellness plan that is flexible and customized to your specific needs is hugely important, because it's one thing to talk about it and after this session ends to hear the information, but to really take this information and develop what would be a wellness plan for you based on all those different categories and maybe additional categories that weren't included. Going forward, so to watch for signs of secondary trauma. And again, I gave that list or several lists of what those signs can be. But to really monitor yourself is the key. To know what your baseline is and know when things seem to be a little different and be able to figure that out. To approach cases with empathy and with trauma-informed responses. So in order to have those highly connective, empathetic engagement, you need that in order to have a truly trauma-informed response, right? So to not abandon empathy, but figure out a way that you can manage being empathetic and not run that risk of secondary trauma, or at least minimize it. And then create and follow an individualized trauma-informed wellness plan. So those are the action words that need exclamation points behind them: create and follow. A lot of times this information is things that we may already know intuitively or have heard before, but the key is to walk away from this session with this information and just take the time to do an individualized trauma-informed wellness plan for yourself. And again, here's my contact information. I'm Miko Anderson. So my email address, phone number, the rest is probably email. But if you have any follow-up questions or anything I can help with, please feel free to reach out and contact me. And with OVC funding, there are several resources that OVC has that have been funded by OVC. So there's technical training, survivor engagement training, human trafficking human trafficking task force e-guides, and so many more that are listed there. So make sure that you take advantage of those resources as well. And then also Equitas, as well as other national technical assistance providers, offers so many different other ways to help you. So if you want to reach out to us or through any of the other OVC anti-trafficking grantees to help you collaborate or figure out a way to do programming, please don't hesitate to do that as well. And then a note that funding is available for enhanced collaborative models, human trafficking task force. So, and the focus is to make sure that you are trauma informed. So we're talking about both direct and indirect secondary trauma informed, victim centered. That way you can really identify and serve all victims in a way that is trauma informed and based on trauma informed practices. And I'd like to also share that Office Hours is a monthly online meeting that happens every Thursday of the month. The audience is generally law enforcement and prosecutors, and they cover a variety of topics. It is an informal conversation, so it allows you to really be able to connect with other practitioners in the area and help with those relationships and get insight on different challenges that you may be facing. The traffic report, this is an online conversation that I host, and it's every last Wednesday of the month, noon to 1 p.m. Pacific time and 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern time. And it's an interactive conversation, very informal, but it's with disciplinary partners on different intersections with human trafficking. So whether it's self-care or challenges or insight, but it's geared toward the multidisciplinary professionals that work in anti-human trafficking.